Thank you so much for joining us for this very special feed swap between Haunted UK Podcast and Macabrium. Macabrium is a podcast for anyone drawn to the dark side of humanity, the shadows of crime, and the legends and ghost stories that blur the lines between truth and myth. Every Tuesday, they share stories that are as unsettling as they are unforgettable, weaving together fact, folklore, and imagination. Hosted by artists Megan Alda and Derek Stephen Brown, who wanted a way to connect and share stories that matter and leave an impact, Macabrium is fueled by curiosity and a love of storytelling. These are the tales that stay with us, whether they come from old case files, folklore, or histories that don't make it into the textbooks. They approach each story with care, honouring the people and experiences at the centre of these narratives. Macabrium is more than exploring the mysterious and the disturbing. It is about the impact stories have on us and the conversations they spark. It is a space for listeners who want to reflect, connect, and perhaps feel a chill or two along the way. Macabrium isn't just about rattling off dry facts. It's about crafting stories so gripping, you'll feel like you're right there in the moment. Every episode is a deep dive into true crime or dark history, told like the best stories around a campfire. There's something timeless about sitting back and listening to a great story. Macabrium captures that tradition, making you feel connected to history in such a natural way. There's no filler, no unnecessary fluff, just well-told, fascinating stories that grab your attention from the very start and don't let go. From ghost stories and local lore to chilling true crime and dark history, Macabrium appeals to listeners who crave rich, diverse, and engaging stories. So, what treat do we have lined up for you today? Well, this is episode 115, Treacherous Seas, a mystery in the graveyard of the Atlantic. There are ships that vanish without a trace, and then there are ships that turn up when they shouldn't. The Carol A. Deering was one of those. A 5-masted schooner found run aground off the Outer Banks in 1921. Her crew gone without explanation. No distress call, no goodbye, nothing. Some say there was mutiny, others say pirates, and a few still wonder if something far stranger was at play. If you love true crime and dark history or lore, Macabrium is your next must-listen. The episodes are audio only for now, but guess what? They're working on video episodes for YouTube right now. Follow their YouTube channel so you'll be ready when the visuals drop. Add Macabrium to your playlist and get hooked on their binge-worthy storytelling. I'm now going to hand over to Macabrium. Sit back and enjoy this episode.
Come with me for a minute. I want you to imagine that you're standing on the deck of a 5-masted tall ship with huge towering sails that stretch right up into the sky. As you move around, your boots hit the deck, making an ungodly creak. You wipe the sweat off your face and you step into the warm glow of your cabin. Outside, the night is howling. The air is cold and wet, but inside, you can finally catch a break. The wing continues to slam into the ship and it rocks you back and forth. You've done this long enough to know when the sea is angry. You grab your pen and paper and you begin documenting the day's events, writing a little bit and then pausing for a second as you look at a month's worth of notes staring back at you. In that moment, you hear a loud thud from above. It sounds almost like it could be thunder, but you know it wasn't, and so you keep your eyes peeled to the ceiling. And then you hear the sound of muffled cries. By now, there's a frantic energy in the air, and it makes the hair on your arms stand up straight. Then, as you hear your men yelling and shouting, your cabin is lit up by a flash of white light. You can't figure out what's going on. Is it the storm outside, or is it a storm inside? Then, in a split second, without even giving you time to react, the door of your cabin is ripped right off its hinges. In that moment, you realize that everything you thought you knew about your voyage shatters. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Macabrium. I'm your host, Megan, and every week we dive into a macabre tale. It could be a mystery, a murder, a lore, a legend, or even a ghost story. Now, after a couple of years podcasting, I feel like I can confidently say that you guys love mysteries, especially those involving the deep blue sea and abandoned ships. I actually started doing the reading on this episode a few months ago because, being a native maritimer, I love a good ghost ship tale myself. And once I started getting into it, I just knew that this story was one that we had to tell. Now, you've probably already heard of the Outer Banks before, maybe through the TV show or maybe from a book or just in passing. But what exactly are they? Well, the Outer Banks is the name given to the string of barrier islands that guard the coast of North Carolina and even parts of Virginia against the Atlantic seas. Now, these islands act like a natural shield, kind of wrapping around and protecting places like Currituck, Albemarle, and Pamlico. And I did my best to pronounce those correctly. I probably went over it about 10 times, and I think that is the best that I can do. So anyway, it wraps around and protects places like those from the open ocean. And just so you know how big it is, the chain runs for about 320 kilometers, which is roughly like 3 hours of highway driving. So quite long. Now, the banks aren't just a line that you'd see on a map. They really shape the place. They've created their own little ecosystem full of plants and wildlife, with a lot of the islands edged by grassy saltwater marshes. Scattered across them, you will also find these quaint little towns, cozy inns, and lively piers. And for the people who live there now, the Outer Banks aren't just home. They're a place with a deep history and something worth protecting. That history goes a very long way back. The Banks were actually one of the first places that European settlers landed, including the infamous lost colony of Roanoke over on Roanoke Island. That is another mystery that we will definitely dive into here another time. But for now, what's important is this. The Outer Banks has always been a landmark, not just culturally, but ecologically and economically too. Still, back when our story takes place, it wasn't known for cute beach towns, stargazing, or picture-perfect lighthouses. There was actually one stretch of these islands with a much darker reputation. It was famous, or should I say infamous, for trapping ships. And no, I'm not talking about sirens or magic. These ships ran aground on hidden shoals. And a shoal is basically a shallow area in the water, like a sandbar. And it can be very, very dangerous for ships. And so that's why this area became known as the Graveyard of the Atlantic. Well, sort of. Okay, friends, so it's that time. Grab a cup of coffee or your favorite beverage of choice, settle in, and let's dive into the mystery of the Carol A. Deering ghost ship. At dawn on January 31st, 1921, surfman C.P. Brady was scanning the horizon. His eyes were sharp and focused. Now, surfmen are experts in the roughest of waters, and Brady knew exactly what to watch for. On this day, Surfman Brady was on lookout duty at the United States Coast Guard base in Cape Hatteras off the Carolina coast. There was a thick mist that morning, but even through it, Brady spotted a ship off in the distance, lying on its side, resting against the shoals. Now, these were the Diamond Shoals, and Brady knew just how unlucky these waters could be. Some people even called this stretch the graveyard of the Atlantic because of how many ships had ended up wrecked in the shallow waters. Now, here's why it was so dangerous. In this part of the Atlantic, the Gulf Stream meets the Virginia Drift, which itself comes from the Labrador Current up in Canada. Now, these are very powerful currents, and they push ships toward shallow waters and onto the sandbar. And that's where vessels get trapped. And a lot of the time, that's where they meet their end. So Surfman Brady sized up the vessel from where he was, and as he did, he immediately thought it couldn't be a shipwreck, for a couple of reasons. For one, the ship looked like it was in good shape. The ship was from a time when these stunning, well-crafted sailing vessels ruled the seas. Yes, it had been run aground on the sandbar, but aside from that, Brady couldn't see any obvious damage. Then, something else caught his attention. No one seemed to be calling for help. The decks looked empty. The ship seemed to be completely devoid of life. Then, just as thoughts of mounting a rescue started creeping into his mind, the weather began to turn. Dark clouds rolled in, and sudden gusts of cold wind shot up from the Atlantic. Now, the thing is, these coasts and the waters, they were watched closely, monitored very closely. So how did this ship, this big, beautiful ship, run aground without anyone noticing overnight? No one had seen the dark outline of her, even though the entire coastline was dotted with stations and men patrolling beaches. These were members of the United States Life-Saving Service, a branch of professionals set up to handle maritime disasters long before the Coast Guard existed. Now, each station was led by a keeper, and under them were surfmen, which were usually local men trained in rescue work and beach patrols. And then what about the ship itself? Hadn't anyone aboard seen the warning beacon of the Cape Hatteras lighthouse? The lighthouse was built in 1870, and it stood watch over the so-called graveyard of the Atlantic ever since. And yet somehow, even with the lighthouse and all of these devoted mariners around, their eyes fixated on the sea at all times, the ship still ran aground, completely unnoticed. Very strange, isn't it? The people that were overseeing the coast's safety figured that since the ship appeared to have no one aboard, it was probably best to wait for the nasty weather to stop. Any sense of urgency that they may have had when they first saw the ship eventually faded because it didn't look like anyone needed rescuing. And so local boatmen who regularly patrolled the shoreline were waiting for the bad weather to subside. For 5 days, the Coast Guard and local reinforcements stayed back, watching the sea rage. Now, 5 days does seem like a really long storm, but a few sources said that it was hurricane-force winds. So if we think in terms of a hurricane, we can sort of imagine the condition of the ship. The Coast Guard also kept wreckers away from the ship, too. Now, wreckers were people who usually took advantage of opportunity, like seeing a wreckage and looting it, but sometimes they would even deliberately lure ships aground to loot them. They would do things like give them false signals, move buoys, they could make fake landmarks, and so much more. So it was very important for authorities to keep any wreckers away. And for all they knew, any wreckers that had approached, maybe they would have thought that they were involved. And so the storms continued, and with each gust of wind and every downpour, the abandoned ship thrashed in the water. Still, no one appeared from the cabin, which means the boat had truly been left behind. Her crew was gone, but the burning question remained: where? On February 4th, a man named James Carlson went aboard a tugboat called Rescue, and he made his way out to the abandoned ship. He noted that the hull had taken a serious beating from the waves. It was splintered all over and worn down by the seawater. Once he climbed aboard, one thing was immediately clear. The ship was completely empty of life. Well, almost. Through the creaking of the wood and the pull of the water, the rescuers heard something very unexpected. They heard a faint, desperate meowing. And right there in the middle of the wreckage, they found a starving but very much alive little cat. Now, aside from that very lucky little cat, there wasn't another soul on board. Now, what makes this even stranger, though, because an abandoned ship is pretty common, but in this instance, the crew's food was still sitting out in the kitchen. It looked like whoever had been eating had just gotten up and left mid-meal. The sources even mention that there was pea soup still in the ladle, ribs still in a pan, and coffee left sitting in the pot. Very odd indeed. Just like people had guessed from the shore, the ship was empty. Everyone was gone. Now, the lifeboats had been used, with ladders still leaning against the deck rails, so basically ready for people to climb down and slide into the boats, but here's where it gets strange. Two of the smaller boats, a dory and a yawl, weren't lowered the right way, not carefully and not smoothly. The ropes holding them had been hacked, almost like it was done in a panic, which sent the boats crashing straight into the water. So what happened? Were the crew in such a rush to get off that they just cut the lines? Or had these ropes been sliced ahead of time? Either way, a mystery was taking shape. And once the rescuers stepped aboard, the questions only seemed to grow, while the answers stayed frustratingly out of reach. Now, here's where things twist a little more, because these details, or at least the way that they were recorded, only deepen the mystery. Now, think about it. Food still set out in the kitchen. And with those sliced cords on the smaller boats, it makes it seem like the crew left in a hurry. But then the rescuers looked a little closer, and guess what they found? Every crew member had neatly packed up their belongings. Strange, right? And it didn't stop there. At first glance, it even looked like the ship's pricey navigation equipment was gone. Then James Carlson started searching in the cabins. And guess what? It only got weirder. The captain's quarters just felt off. Something was not right. His main bed looked completely untouched, like it hadn't been used at all, while the guest bed showed signs of being used. And inside the private bathroom, the navigational charts scattered around like they'd just been chucked without any care. So what exactly was happening on this ship? The rescuers then discovered that some of the ship's steering equipment had been deliberately damaged. One account actually describes it like this. It says, the steering wheel was shattered, the rudder disconnected from its stock, and the binnacle box smashed apart. And that phrasing comes directly from one of our main sources for this episode called the Historical Blindness Podcast. And honestly, if you're curious about more of the technical or historical details, I really recommend checking them out. They do amazing work and they deserve their roses. Okay, now I will admit I had to look this up myself. A binnacle box is basically a fixed stand where the navigator would keep important tools like a sextant or compass, kind of like their command station. So seeing it broken apart like that, well, that's not a good sign. Not far from this mess, a sledgehammer was found, propped casually against a wall. The question practically writes itself. Was that the very tool used to wreck the ship's steering? Some more bizarre things that they noticed were that the ship's anchors were gone, just missing, completely missing. And on top of that, the lights that should have been glowing to warn others that the vessel was out of control had all burned out, which means at some point they had been switched on, likely signaling distress for quite a while before the ship finally drifted and ran aground under the cover of night. So what do we make of that? Was this vessel flashing her warning out into the empty waters for hours, maybe even longer, with no one to answer? Or was something darker at play? Some kind of sabotage, maybe, from within? Whatever it was, the questions kept piling up. Now, the ship's official papers were also gone. They couldn't be found anywhere. The United States Coast Guard cutter, called the Manning, which is like a patrol boat, was sent in to take anything usable from the vessel. After the rescuers combed through the ship, gathering whatever items or information they could for their reports, then the wreckers moved in. And here's the thing. In her prime, this ship had been a real beauty, strong and very proud. But the sea had taken its toll on her, and most of her was ruined. There was barely anything salvageable. In the end, the decision was made that she had to be dynamited, so she wouldn't pose a hazard to other ships. And so on March 4th, just 1 month after they first boarded, the abandoned ship was returned, piece by piece, into the ocean. At least that's what the official accounts say. But some sources say it a little more poetically. They say that as crews loaded their boats with dynamite and approached the shattered hull of what had once been a great ship, the sea seemed to wake up. The air turned wild and a sudden storm blew in, and the crew could just watch, frozen, as the waves ripped through the wreckage, swallowing the remains of the mysterious Carol A. Deering forever. I actually really like that more poetic version myself. By 1921, when our story takes place, steam engines were making sailing ships feel almost old-fashioned. But ships like the Carol Deering, well, they were still top of the line, sturdy, and very much useful for trade. The ship's name was stenciled right on the back. And once the Coast Guard figured out who she was, their main investigation kicked off immediately. Their goal was to trace the last known movements of the Deering. The ship belonged to the G.G. Deering Company, based in Bath, Maine. Launched in 1919, the Carol E. Deering was the crown jewel of Gardner Deering's fleet of 99 wooden merchant ships. He had her named after his own son, and she was the biggest, and she was the last ship that he ever built. She was so big that she could carry a load of up to 3,500 tons. Then in the late 1920s, the Deering set sail for Rio de Janeiro. Her hull was packed with coal. During the first leg of the journey, the original captain, Captain Merritt, became incredibly sick and wasn't able to continue the journey. And so a man named Willis Wormel stepped in to take command. Captain Wormel had 10 crewmen with him on what would become the Deering's final voyage. One thing we know for certain, 11 souls plus at least one cat boarded the ship, and 11 souls left it and were never seen again. What immediately puzzled investigators was this. If the ship had run aground before the crew abandoned it, they likely would have made it safely to shore. The sandbars were shallow, and the coast wasn't far, so how did no one make it back? That's one of the many mysteries that still linger. My guess? The crew probably left the ship well before it ran aground. Here's what we do know, at least from various accounts. After dumping the coal in Rio, the Deering headed back towards the United States, with plans to dock in Norfolk, Virginia. One of her stops along the way was Barbados. While on shore leave there, Captain Wormel ran into another East Coast captain, a G.W. Bunker from Maine. The two spent the day talking, but Captain Wormel seemed to be doing a lot of venting. He was telling Bunker that his first mate, Charles McClellan, was hard-headed, and McClellan, during his own shore leave, had been celebrating a little too much, so much so that Barbadian authorities actually tossed him in jail. Apparently, in the tavern that he was in, he loudly declared that he was going to murder Wormel. So, as you can see, tension was definitely real between the two men. But history has softened the story a little bit because apparently Captain Wormel himself bailed McClellan out. And soon enough, they were both back on board the Deering. But could this rivalry have played a role in the ship's fate? Could McClellan have stirred a mutiny? I mean, it's all speculation, but it definitely makes you think. I should also include here, it's said that in Rio, Wormel actually confided in a skipper that he felt like his whole crew, except for an engineer named Herbert Bates, might turn on him. So it seems he wasn't able to keep command of his crew. And of course, this could be because of a number of factors. For whatever reason, the crew and the new captain were not meshing. If a mutiny did happen and the crew took over the ship, maybe that's why the captain's bed appeared to not have been used, while the guest bed looked occupied. Was the new de facto captain, whoever that was, struggling with how he got the job? Even if that were the case, though, it doesn't explain the biggest mystery. How no one, not a single soul, was ever found after the ship ran aground. And why the steering equipment was smashed. Did someone decide the ship should stay put rather than being steered by someone else? After leaving Barbados, maritime logs show that the Deering sailed for 5 grueling weeks through brutal weather. The Atlantic was, and still is, merciless. And you can't help but feel that in this story, the sea isn't just a backdrop. She's almost a character herself, a force with intent, maybe even a co-conspirator. Then one day, about 145 kilometers off Cape Hatteras, a lightship that was manned by James Steele actually spotted the Deering. Now, a lightship is like a lighthouse boat. It's a boat with a light, guiding or warning other boats. Now, at the time, Captain Steele didn't think much of it, but later, when he learned the ship's fate, that encounter stuck with him, and he replayed it in his mind over and over, looking for clues. Maybe for a glance, a gesture, something that could hint at what had gone wrong. He remembered seeing the crew out on the deck, just tinkering around. Now, that alone was odd. Normally, some would be below deck, and anyone who was on deck would be working, not lounging around. He also remembered being greeted over megaphone by a tall, skinny, red-headed man with what sounded like a Scandinavian accent. This man didn't match the description of Captain Wormel or First Mate McClellan. So, who was he? It really makes you wonder, had the captain and first mate already been killed from mutiny or otherwise? And was this man suddenly thrust into leadership? Several men of Scandinavian origin were listed on the ship's manifest, all lower ranked. So maybe this man was one of them. And maybe his unease at taking command explains why he slept in the guest bed and not the captain's. Steele also remembered that the man had asked him to pass a message to the G.G. Deering Company in Bath, Maine. He said that the ship had lost its anchor off Cape Fear while waiting out a windstorm. That at least explains the missing anchors, but of course the bigger question still looms: how could an entire crew disappear without a trace? Right there, so close to the shore. Some accounts even add another layer. Captain Steele's own ship, it said, was malfunctioning, so he couldn't radio for help. And the tall red-haired man, well, he didn't seem flustered at all. Was he relieved That less attention would be drawn to them, or maybe buying time? Or did he simply feel confident that in that moment, their situation wasn't as desperate as it might have seemed? It's then said that the next day, another ship spotted the Deering. She was gliding smoothly toward the Diamond Shoals, but no one was visible on deck. The crew of the second vessels weren't worried, though, because they just assumed whoever was on board would eventually turn the ship around, or at the very least, see the massive lighthouse at Cape Hatteras. But of course, that didn't happen. The Deering ran aground not long after, and her crew were never seen again. Lula Wormel wasn't having it, and just like us, she couldn't wrap her head around how the crew vanished without a trace. But her search for answers wasn't just curiosity, it was grief, because Lula was Captain Wormel's daughter, and she, more than anyone, couldn't understand why none of the men aboard the Deering returned safely from what should have been a routine shipping mission. Now, so far, this story is sprinkled with hints, little morsels that might put us in one direction or another. Maybe a mutiny broke out on board, maybe it led to deaths and to damaged equipment, and maybe that damage forced the remaining crew to abandon ship. But even if that were true, it still doesn't explain why most of them just disappeared. That is, if you don't take the sea into account. Of course, it wouldn't be a Macabrium episode if we didn't explore some of the theories about this case. One's questioned, one's debated, and still completely unresolved. When he first boarded the Deering, Captain Carlson noticed something curious in the ship's logbook. Captain Wormel's handwriting appeared consistently up until January 23rd, and then suddenly it changed. He also spotted books in Wormel's cabin that didn't belong to him. Clearly, someone else had taken command. By all accounts, mutiny seemed like it could be at the heart of it all. And because none of the lifeboats or survivors were ever found, some theorized that maybe the lifeboats had been sunk intentionally to cover tracks. Some sources even say that maybe the Deering's survivors were picked up, boats and all, by another ship attempting a rescue. But what if, tragically, that vessel disappeared too? Around the same time, an oil steamer called the SS Hewitt vanished off the Carolina coast. Could it have picked up the Deering crew only to vanish itself? It is possible. It's said that after Captain Steele spotted the Deering and told the red-haired man that he couldn't offer any help, he noticed an oil steamer passing by. Hoping it might assist the Deering, he flagged it down. But the ship kept going. They didn't respond at all. And then Steele noticed something strange. Its name had been removed, and it just passed by, completely ignoring them, and it never returned. Some sources say that this ship could have been the SS Hewitt, clearly taken by pirates, and it begs the question, would this pirate crew come back for the Deering's crew too? And let's not forget the disappearance ties very neatly into the paranormal reputation of the Bermuda Triangle, the stretch of ocean bound by Florida, Puerto Rico, and Bermuda. Technically, both the Carol A. Deering and the SS Hewitt were in the northernmost waters of the triangle when they vanished. Speaking of which, we are going to deep dive into the Bermuda Triangle on a future episode because there is so much lore tied to it. But for now, let's get back to our ghost ship. Now, speaking of lore, before we get into the pirate angle, I want to quickly explore another curious piece of this story. This case is packed with mariner lore, after all. And what's a tale about the sea without a message in a bottle? In April, a fisherman named Christopher Columbus Gray was walking along a beach in Cape Hatteras when he spotted a bottle with a message inside. He took it out and gave it a read, and here's what it said. Deering captured by oil-burning boat, something like chaser. Taking off everything, handcuffing crew hiding all over ship. No chance to make escape. Finder, please notify headquarters Deering. So naturally, the piracy theorists went wild, but they still needed to do their due diligence and look into this message in a bottle. First, they looked into the bottle, and they found that it had been made in Brazil. Then the handwriting was examined by people who knew the Deering's crew, and eventually it was said to have been from a man who was trusted by Captain Wormel himself. Well, this sent the press wild. Soon the story spiraled. Some claimed the pirates had submarines. Others said that the stolen goods lined up with the items banned in communist countries. Because remember, context is key. This all happened during the Red Scare, a time of intense anti-communist vibes in the United States. So a lot of people said it could have been what they called commies behind the Deering's disappearance. But as juicy as the pirate theory was, it didn't hold up under scrutiny. For one, why would pirates go through the trouble of taking the crew in lifeboats, only to leave the ship itself aground? If piracy were involved, the ship, the real asset, would have been the prize. Remember the episode we did on Blackbeard? Capturing ships was how pirates built their fleets. By the 1920s, though, the golden age of sail was long over, and wooden sailing ships, and piracy itself, were fading. Still, some believed it, including Captain Wormel's widow. But Captain O.W. Parker of the United States Marine Shipping Board disagreed. He said piracy was timeless. And you know what? He was right. Now here we are in 2025, and piracy is still a major global threat to shipping, and it results in death and hostage situations. So it's funny to look back at that and see he was very much correct. Another strange theory was weird weather. And I mean, out at sea, anything is possible. Maybe a freak storm blocked the crew from reaching shore. Maybe it damaged the ship, but the steering? That felt too intentional. And it seemed that the crew were comfortable enough before leaving the ship, which suggests they thought leaving was safe, so what went wrong? Well, experts would later point out that the Deering was steering clear of any known hurricane paths at the time, so it's unlikely that it was just bad weather. But now let's go back to that message in a bottle. Well, shockingly, the message found by Christopher Columbus Gray turned out to be a hoax. A little digging by a federal agent revealed the truth. Christopher really wanted to be a keeper, and since that job was hard to come by, he figured the fastest way was to find a clue to the nation's biggest maritime mystery at the time and present himself as a hero. Classic career move, right? Well, unfortunately for him, it didn't work out. And with the hoax exposed, the piracy theory lost a lot of its spark. But even though the piracy theory never stuck, a lot of people still thought something paranormal was at work. And that feeling only grew in 1955, when divers exploring the Diamond Shoals found the Deering's rusted hull, half buried in the sand. Barnacles clung to the warped timbers, and every broken plank seemed to whisper about the lost crew. Locals started swearing that it was cursed, a ghost ship back to lure away other sailors. And the Deering's legend only grew. There are a few other theories about what might have happened to the Deering, although we won't spend too much time on them because there is very little evidence to support them. So some say that the crew may have been fleeing disease or another unseen danger, abandoning the ship in a hurry and leaving everything behind. Others think that the vessel might have been seized or commandeered by government authorities, maybe for reasons we'll never know, leaving no trace of what became of those souls on board. And a few have even speculated that the Deering was somehow tied up in Prohibition-era smuggling, vanishing to cover illicit activity or avoid capture. Now, each of these ideas has its gaps, but together they hint at the kind of strange unsolved mystery that keeps the Deering's legend alive, decades later. In the end, a federal investigation pushed for by Lula Wormel came up empty. There was no conclusive explanation for the disappearance of the 11 souls aboard the Carol E. Deering. The ship, the last of its kind, met an untimely end. With it, one can only imagine the great age of sail quietly bowing out, making way for the age of steam engines. It was sort of a poetic, heart-rending farewell to a beautiful vessel. For the families of those lost, the unthinkable remained, the unknown. Grief, after all, is often compared to the ocean. Waves ebb and flow, carrying moments of joy and pain in endless cycles. But grief can feel bottomless. And when you don't know what happened to someone you love, that uncertainty can be relentless. This story has no clear answers, only questions, only mystery. And so I ask all of you, everyone listening out there, what do you think happened? What do you imagine became of them? Remember how I said the sea is almost like a character in this story? Well, I like to think that when you tell the water your secrets, or when the water knows, it has the power to enact its own kind of justice. So did the sea act? Did she lash out at treacherous, maybe even murderous men, sending them to their deaths just miles from shore? Were they fleeing a broken ship or the threat of imprisonment? Maybe that's why they vanished, under the cover of darkness, never to be seen again. Or maybe they did escape, reinvented themselves, vanished into new lives. Perhaps something even scarier, something we're not used to confronting. The sea, after all, is chaos in its purest form. It's beautiful, it's cruel, and indiscriminate. Maybe she simply claimed these mariners, as she has claimed so many before. No rhyme, no reason, just nature doing what she does. And in considering that possibility, we're faced with one of life's greatest truths. Even with all of our technology, our wars, our commerce, nature reminds us, she humbles us, and we must always remember, we exist as a part of her, not apart from her. And that is our tale for today, friends. It definitely has me thinking the entire time doing this episode. All I could think was, can you imagine if they knew that all this time later, people were thinking about them and learning about them and saying their names? I just thought that was a really cool aspect to think about, and I'm happy that we're able to keep this story alive. Remember, you can subscribe to us on YouTube, give us a share. If you liked this episode, you can comment, leave a rating. We really want to be able to do this full time. There are so many more stories we want to tell, and your listens, your support, it helps us get there. Stay curious, friends. Stay cautious, and I'll see you all next time for another mystery.